agencies here in Israel and around the world enables us to respond immediately in times like these. With our vital support, our agencies on the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis are able to continue, adapt, and even increase their care for those most vulnerable in the face of unprecedented challenges. After our program, we'll email you some information about how to learn more about us, along with more great virtual opportunities to connect. Before we get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes. First, your microphone is muted now for the presentation, but you will be able to ask questions during our Q&A time afterwards. In addition, you can adjust the way your screen appears. If you would like to view the person who is speaking or asking a question, please select Speaker View at the top of your Zoom screen. Now, it is my privilege to introduce our presenter, Rene Silvin. Born in New York, Richard Rene Silvin grew up in Switzerland. He holds a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University and an MBA from Cornell. He is the retired CEO of a company which owned and operated hospitals in 10 countries. Historian and author of 5 books, Rene invites you on a trip through the history with glamour and drama and some of the heartbreaking ends to the world's greatest ocean liners. His regular transatlantic crossings as a child on the great ocean liners constitute his happiest memories and gave rise to a lifelong study of these same ocean liners. From the glamorous life aboard the Normandy to the sinking of the Titanic and the Andrea Doria, Rene will share some details of these and several other tragic stories. So welcome, Rene. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before we get into the show, I'd like to call it a show. We don't like the word lecture. I'm not lecturing at you. We want you to have a good time. Before we get into the show, I did want to shout out a word of thanks to the Jewish Federation of South Palm Beach County. Everybody is struggling to learn how Zoom works and how the planning for these events take place. And as we're gearing up for this, a lot of people aren't doing it very efficiently, but you ladies that I am looking at on the screen now have done so efficiently. And I'm very grateful for that, and I hope that our audience recognizes that too. So I'm going to start now with, we'll just put on the PowerPoint. This is all about the pictures that we have in our PowerPoint. So the ships that we're going to review are, of course, more or less in chronological order, by the way. Of course, how can you talk about ship disasters in the 20th century without talking about Titanic? Titanic had a sister, by the way, and we're going to talk about the sister, which was the Britannic. And then, of course, we'll get into the Lusitania, which so many people know about because it is basically what is credited for having gotten the United States into the First World War. We'll go on to the great, fabulous Normandy and her tragic story, and then we'll end with the Andrea Doria. When I was a child, as Catherine had said, my parents lived on both opposite sides of the Atlantic. And so as a little child, I was ferried back and forth when I was to visit one parent or the other. This is a picture of my mother taking me aboard the French flagship Liberté, which survived the Second World War. I was very fortunate to be able to do that because I knew all of the great liners that had survived the Second World War. And then, of course, when they reached their life limit, they were all scrapped in the 1960s. Now, as we get into this, I'd like you to, if I may suggest, think about why it is that so many fabulous books were written and movies were made about glamorous love affairs on ships. I propose to you it is because once you're on the North Atlantic and you are neither in the one side or the other side, it's like being suspended in space. and inhibitions are let down, and that's why I believe so many wonderful love affairs took place and were recorded as we went on ships. As we get into the stories, I'm not going to just focus on the disaster itself that took place, because I would very much like you to become a little bit familiar with what each of these grand ships was famous for, and what life was like aboard them before they met their end. So the Titanic had two sisters. There were three sister ships that the White Star Line had created called the Olympic class. The first ship to come in service was 1912, and it was the Olympic itself. It was followed a year later by the Titanic, and finally the Britannic came, and we'll talk about that also. I'm going to play for you a brief clip, which is an actual clip of what dinner in the first class dining room on the Olympic was like. And the reason this is important is because now this is an exact sister and an exact copy of the Titanic. So the Titanic was marginally larger than the ships that had come before it. Not enormously larger, but larger enough so that in first class, you dressed for dinner, you were served more properly. And that's the exact proportions of the dining room on the Titanic. Unlike the way Cameron projects it in the movie, The Titanic, where the spaces projected are in fact much bigger than they were in reality. All three sisters had the fabulous and famous iconic first class staircase, the one that the movie made famous when Jack, the character Jack, sent a note to character Rose saying, "Make it count, meet me at the clock." This was the size of the best first class suites on Titanic. Notice the fireplace. Ships in those days still had fireplaces. And this was a better than most, but still not as grand as we're going to see. The picture that's on the screen now is what steerage was like, where four people were crammed into that kind of space without any kind of ventilation. So the Titanic actually boasted about the fact that it had fewer lifeboats. It had fewer lifeboats because, after all, it was unsinkable, and fewer lifeboats allowed more space on deck for people to catch the air and maybe do a few exercises. They were so proud of that because the ship was unsinkable, after all, so why should they have lifeboats enough for everybody? We see here a picture of Captain Smith on the left of the Titanic. He was going to retire after breaking the Titanic in. He had had an illustrious career as a captain. And next to him is the head of the White Star Line, and they were inspecting the ship while it was being constructed. This is an actual picture of Titanic leaving her home port for the first and only time, the home port of Southampton, on April 10 of 1912. The way the routes ran in those days was that you'd leave Southampton. A few hours later, you would be over in Cherbourg to pick up French passengers. The next day, you would go to Cork. And on the trip that the Titanic made between Cherbourg and Cork, it passed, for the first and only time, its sister, the Olympic. And then from Cork on, it was headed towards the United States, where on April 15th, it met the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. And within a very short period of time, 1,500 or more passengers would be killed. I'm going to play a computer reenactment of the ship hitting the iceberg now. And as in so many disasters, there are a lot of ifs. If she had hit the iceberg head on, she wouldn't have sank. If the watertight compartments that you will see now in orange, the vertical lines, had extended one deck higher, she wouldn't have sank. If the berg had pierced one fewer compartments, 5 instead of 6, she wouldn't have sank. But all of those ifs obviously didn't work out. And it is filling an ice tray of water in reverse. She took a list to the bow and to the starboard side, and there was a big intrigue because some passengers, survivors, had said that the third aft of the ship did in fact separate, and that was proven, of course, when the wreck was discovered. When that third aft uprighted itself, believe it or not, it was buoyant for almost a minute. And the people who were hanging, hundreds of people who were hanging onto the railings at the back end of the ship, had some hope that they would survive, but of course it then rapidly went under the water. Lots of loss of life and some very famous people, including John Jacob Astor, the famous businessman and philanthropist Benjamin Guggenheim, and the Darling Strauss couple. The Strausses had co-founded Macy's. There was a wonderful story. They were going to help her into a lifeboat. And she said, but what about my husband? And no, ma'am, your husband can't join. She was taken out of the lifeboat and she said, I've never been away from him and I'm not going to be away from him now. They went back to their suite and went back to bed and they drowned that way. The captain and the chief purser also went down with the ship. The survivors stayed in cold water. This was icy cold water. Way up north, even in summertime, it's icy cold. They stayed shivering in those lifeboats until the Carpathia came to their rescue early the following morning. These are actual pictures of the lifeboats arriving at the Carpathia, including this one in which it is reputed that the famous Molly Brown was. Molly Brown, by the way, was not only the unsinkable Molly Brown, she was also the unburnable Molly Brown because she was in the famous Breakers fire in Palm Beach in March of 1924. But imagine the bedlam on the deck of the Carpathia. People were trying to find out if their loved ones were there. People were running around trying to make lists of family members. The information, there was no information. There was just shock and horror as they were regrouping on the deck of the Carpathia. And the Titanic stayed in its resting place until 1985 when Robert Ballard found it. It's in over 2 miles of depth of water, and the deeper you are, the less deterioration there is. And that's why in the whole time that it sat down there, the ship was still in fairly good shape. And this iconic picture of the bow of the ship made so famous by DiCaprio and Winslet in the movie Titanic. We're now going to move on to the sister that I spoke about. The identical sister of the Titanic was the Britannic. The Britannic never sailed as a passenger liner because the First World War broke out, and she was converted into a hospital ship that could carry 3,000 people, wounded people from the Dardanelles because of the Battle of Gallipoli. She had made 5 successful trips before she would make the doomed trip. She was by far the largest ship lost in World War II. I beg your pardon, in World War I. This is the largest ship that we had in World War I. It was 15,000 tons, a battleship. The Britannic and the Titanic were 45,000 tons. So imagine, commercial shipping was a very big deal. And that's why those ships had become larger and more technically advanced, even than warships in those days. So to have that enormous ship to be its hospital ship was a great help in its first 4 runs. Like its sister, the Titanic, it had one of those beautiful iconic central staircases, except without a clock, it had that pretty mural. But all of the rooms had been converted to cots and patient beds. The dining rooms had been converted to operating rooms. And she was making her 5th run to Greece, going through what's known as the Kea Channel, when she hit a mine on November 21 of 1916 and sank fairly quickly. However, it's interesting to know that nobody was killed in the explosion itself. This is a reenactment of the nurses running around getting ready to abandon ship. Fortunately, as I said, there were no patients aboard. There was just the staff going to pick up the wounded soldiers. But the one odd, horrible thing happened was that some of the lifeboats were lowered into the water too early. And the propeller, the aft propeller, was still turning. And the only people who were killed were the 30 people who were chopped up by the turning propeller from the security that they thought was their lifeboat. And here is a computer reenactment of the Britannia going down. It was So at 9:07, in only 55 minutes, under the water she went. And she laid there undisturbed until Jacques Cousteau found her in 1975. Which brings us to the Lusitania, the ship that most people think was responsible for getting the United States into the First World War. She had grand interiors. The interiors of ships in those days were made to show off the best of their country of origin. This is the first class dining room in the Georgian style, and the beautiful living room with its glass domed ceilings in the Queen Anne style. This was the size of the suites of that ship, very similar to the best suites of the Titanic. Something that's interesting is that 2 weeks before her fatal voyage, the imperial government of Germany had put a notice in the New York newspapers warning Americans not to travel on these ships. It said that passengers were reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies, and Great Britain and her allies. And the article went on to clearly warn that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of the Great Britain and her allies do so at their own risk. Nobody paid any attention to this thing because it was inconceivable that a major liner would ever be sunk. And we see it here on its final departure from New York on the 1st of May as she leaves the harbor. What they were worried about was the new phenomena of U-boats, German submarines. They were brand new. And up to that date, they had only sunk a few freighters. They had not sunk any major ship until that time. These U-boats were horribly cramped. You had 35 crew cramped into that little boat where you couldn't even stand up properly. And they were on patrol between England and Wales and Ireland, looking around when at one point the captain surfaced, and what did he see right in front of him but one of the largest ships in the world. He let off a torpedo, which most people think that there were 2 torpedoes. In fact, there were not. There was this single torpedo, which created a separate and secondary explosion in the engine room, and the ship took water very quickly. Ireland was in sight. The coast of Ireland was in sight. But we see here a computer reenactment of the ship going down and the survivors in their lifeboats. This was called 18 Minutes of Terror. And a huge loss of life, not quite as much as the Titanic, but over 1,200 people. Alfred Vanderbilt went down doing heroic acts for people to save them. These are pictures of the few people that did arrive on the coast, and look at the mass funerals that followed and buried into the mass graves. She lay there quite undisturbed until she was discovered in 1935. And now we go into the grand era of transatlantic passage, the heyday of style and luxury, where all of the glamorous people, ships now were getting larger and more glamorous and had more original art in them. After all, after the First World War, which was the war to end all wars, that was the time of the roaring 1920s and the great excesses. Why not? There wasn't ever going to be another war, and so these ships all got bigger and bigger. I had mentioned that the Titanic and the Britannic were about 45,000 tons each. Normandy was 85,000 tons. Imagine the enormous leap forward in terms of size and speed and style and artwork. In my opinion, the Normandy is the penultimate of ships. It's something that has fascinated me ever since I was a child, and I wrote a coffee table book about it. I never saw Normandy because it sank before I was born. But as I had said, I traveled back and forth on the French liners as a small ship. And what I loved doing was speaking and engaging all members that I could, from the officers to the other first-class passengers and to passengers in other classes. And everybody would say to me, if you liked this ship, you would have loved Normandy. And so I studied Normandy, even though I had never seen it as a child. This is a computer reenactment. This is an actual newsreel of the launching of Normandy when the biggest bottle of champagne was cracked across the bow of the biggest ship ever. No ship even close to this size had successfully come down what is called a glide path. Glide path is where the ship that is finished comes down. This glide path in this ship was 300 feet longer than any other, and other ships had capsized coming down the glide path. And there was 200,000 people came from all over France to see this event. It had been publicized for years, the construction of this ship. She comes into the water successfully to great cries of joy in the Marseillaise, and no one had any idea of the backwash that it would create, and 50 people were washed into the water. Fortunately, no one was hurt. It was high glamour. These are the Morgan sisters, by the way. Anderson Cooper's grandmother, Gloria Vanderbilt, is on the right. And this is the way people traveled when they got on these ships. This is a picture of the front doors to the first class dining room. This is not a hotel. This is an actual picture. The people in it are models, so they weren't passengers. But imagine the sizing, given this, you've seen the proportions that I showed you of the Titanic. Imagine coming double in the size where you could have some of the major rooms on 2 and even 3 decks. Notice the vents over the doors. This was the first ship to have air conditioning. 1935, air conditioning was practically unheard of. When you came in through those doors into the first class dining room, it was a cascade of gorgeous Lalique lights. Every single light in first class on a Normandy was Lalique. You walked past those 2 big murals that are on the side. Those are actually ox blood marble gros relief murals that you walked by before you came down the steps so that women could make their grand entrance into the first class dining room. Notice the cascades of Lalique as well as the wall sconces of Lalique and the fabulous coffered ceiling. There was a forward looking over the bow winter garden with 64 windows in it. It had several aviaries, and nobody ever reported anything bad about smells. They just were looking at the birds and fish down in the pond below. It had topiaries that people gave special photographies in. This is the first class lounge, all Aubusson fabric, if you please. The back panels are reverse painted mirrors, which were stunning and 7,000 pounds each. The cascades were Lalique. The other indirect lighting was computer vases by Patou. If the doors in the back of the first class living room were opened, as they are now in this picture, you walked through to the smoking room with another set of beautiful murals, all in enamel. And then you went up a staircase through 3 decks. And notice this staircase, because we're going to come back to it, where you went up into the Café Grill, which was an a la carte restaurant in the Bauhaus style, all in pink lighting. The Lalique cascades reflected a pink light, and the walls had pink leather on them. So this is the size now of suites on Normandy. They were at least twice the size of suites on its predecessor. The living room here, a little dining room in the far end, and those suites had 2 bedrooms and 2 baths each. Up until this time, there were very few ships that had ensuite bathrooms in other than just maybe some of the best suites. Her arrival in New York was triumphant. 200,000 people lined both sides of the Hudson to see Normandy come in. The dock at which she docks had to be extended because no 1,000-foot ship had ever come into the city. It was an enormous event. And of course, all the glamour people flocked to Normandy. Marlene Dietrich at the time was the highest paid actress in the world. She was making films at both sides of the Atlantic, and she traveled on Normandy several times a year. I like to say that perhaps she's traveling light on this particular trip, but I guess you need that many suitcases if you're going to change 4 times a day and if you're going to walk along the decks in this kind of glamorous outfit. This is the first class swimming pool, indoor swimming pool. The first time there had been indirect lighting, such as like that beautiful ceiling. It was completely lined with Sèvres glass mosaics. And remember this picture because we will come back to it also. And there's the pool. There is Johnny Weissmuller reenacting some of his Tarzan dives for curious first-class passengers during one of the crossings. Joan Crawford pretending to be serving Thanksgiving dinner, and some of the other famous people. There were just so many, but I love this one of Bob and Dolores Hope sitting in the Winter Garden. So as the war was ramping up, the Second World War was ramping up, Normandy made her last crossing to the United States in late August of 1939. And these are actual pictures of her coming into New York. She sailed across completely blacked out. No radio communication, no lights, all the windows were blacked out in case that there was a U-boat waiting for her. She made the crossing successfully, but I guess Captain de la Garandrie would never have believed that when he shut the engines down that night at 6 p.m. at its dock in New York, that they would never be turned on again. You see, Normandy was supposed to sail 2 days later, going back to France. And as passengers were waiting to board her, the American Coast Guard came aboard to search her just in case she might be carrying munitions. And during the extra day and time that took, the French line decided to leave her for safekeeping in New York, and that's where she stayed. She stayed under French control in New York until 1940, the following year, when France fell to the Germans. So technically speaking, now that great ship could be commandeered by the Germans. So we in America seized the ship with something called a writ of angery, which means that you can seize an asset of a potential foreign hostile power. And she became part of the United States Navy. The big question was, what are we going to do with this huge ship? Our largest aircraft carrier at the time was half the size of Normandy. So one of the ideas was to remove her superstructure and to turn her into the United States' only large aircraft carrier. The other option was, since she had enough power to power the entire island of Manhattan, to use her as an auxiliary generator in case Manhattan, for some reason during the war, was to lose power. And the third option was to convert her into a troop ship. That is the option that was adopted. The United States had no large troop ships. The British did by converting the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth. The French did by converting their ships, but we had no large troop carrier. Sadly, as the Coast Guard and the Navy took over the ship, one of the things that they did was to dismiss the 24 full-time members of the Paris Fire Department who worked on Normandy and who manned the first ever smoke detector system. It was the most efficient and the most advanced fire detection plan in the world, but they were all let go during the conversion. One wonderful thing, which I like to call divine intervention, took place when a bunch of Franco-Americans in the Franco-American community got together, and without any kind of permission, they got lots of people aboard to save and to crate up as much of the artwork as possible. This is that gorgeous first-class dining room with people packing up crates of the Lalique Cascades. The problem began in this particular spot. They were going to remove that last cascade of Lalique. Now imagine what it was like. There were 3,000 workmen reporting to 60 different contractors, working round the clock to get this ship converted in record-breaking time. Also in that day, they brought in that particular room there, the first-class living room, they had put 15,000 cork life preservers. Those cork life preservers were highly flammable. They were all in that room when a spark flew from that Lalique cascade over to the life preservers. Guess what? The fire alarm system had been disconnected, and there were no fire extinguishers to be found in all of the places where they had been kept. And perhaps worse than that, there was no matching hose fittings. The metric hoses that the French had aboard the ship had been removed in order to have imperial style hoses, and they couldn't even start the water system. So within minutes, the ship was engulfed in flames. And this is a newsreel depicting that.
February 9th, 1942, the Normandy afire, a fatal tragedy to the big luxury liner and to America. As the flames rapidly spread to devastating fury, workers madly scrambled to safety, while fireboats and fire engines poured tons of water into the stricken vessel. All fire doors, vertical and horizontal, were closed to protect the ship's vitals from the flames, but this was all in vain. Dense clouds of thick, acrid smoke billowed far out over Manhattan, casting a mucky pall over Midtown and downtown New York.
It was a mistake to close all the fire doors because it trapped the water on the upper decks, and the ship began to list very quickly. By nighttime, at around 10 o'clock at night, the fire was out, and this is what Normandy looked like. The Navy was on the phone to the president because the president was closely watching this to make sure that we would have the first and only large troop ship for the United States. And they were telling him, we will save it. She's been saved. And she will not capsize. You see, if a ship capsizes, she's generally lost. If she sinks into the mud, which is called scuttling, she's generally saved. On the dock that night was this man, Vladimir Yorkovich. He was the ship's architect, and he was pleading with the authorities to let him on that ship and open some of those watertight doors and some of the windows on the port side of the ship so that the upper deck water would drain. And he was denied access to the ship. And so as he was correct, it did, when the tide rose, Normandy did turn over, and there she lay, right in the middle of Manhattan. It was a terrible blow to American morale. Remember, 6 weeks before, these were the images that Americans had of that war in a far-off place called Hawaii, which wasn't even a state. And these images had been indelibly marked in their minds, and now this is what they saw at the foot of 55th Street in New York. The Navy was convinced that she could be salvaged, even though the French engineers and architects said that there was no way. But the most complex salvage project ever began immediately. This is, look at the city of workmen that showed up on barges. This is the Normandy with her superstructure removed already. She became buoyant in November. There was still this dream that she could be saved. And look at the tragic story of that first-class swimming pool in Sèvres-Glace as they emptied that out. And the staircase that we looked at going from the smoking room up to the Cafe Grill. She was towed off to the Navy yards in Brooklyn in the hope that she could be rehabilitated, but it was all for naught. And she was sold to the Lipstick Brothers, who towed her over to New Jersey and took her apart piece by piece. And the end of the Normandy was not really until the end of the taking apart in 1947. Which brings us to our last story, the Andrea Doria. The Italians had had a very big presence in luxury liners on the North Atlantic before the war. They had two sisters, the Conte de Savoia and the Rex. Both of those, as you can see from the dates, that they were sunk and one was bombed and the other was sunk during the war. So the Italians had no ships after the war, and they were determined to make its entry with the Andrea Doria. The Italian route was wonderful because it was a southern route that the Italian ships took. And this route existed right up until the end when they came out with the Michelangelo and the Raffaello. But it was wonderful. You started in Genoa, the home port of these ships. A few hours later, you were in Cannes, France, and you picked up the French passengers. The next day, you were in Naples, where you had a whole day in Naples before going off to Gibraltar and then racing across the Atlantic. Instead of a 6-day trip, it was a 9-day trip. And a lot of people really enjoyed that southern route because the weather was usually fabulous. Here is a newsreel explaining why the Andrea Doria was so important to the Italians.
The Doria was also a symbol of the revival of Italy from World War II. It was an object of great pride for the Italian nation. The Andrea Doria is also one of the saints, equipped with radar and Lorraine, long-range electronic navigation.
This is me. I'm the little kid in front. I'm the little tyke in the front there. It was the Andrea Doria's last successful westbound crossing with Naples in the background. On the next westbound is when she went down. She had beautiful mid-century modern interiors. This is the first class lounge and the first class dining room. And it was a 3-class ship. This picture is taken from the first class deck, looking down at the tourist class deck at Christmas time, and then beyond it is the steerage class. Each deck had its own swimming pool, and since it came through a southern route, people had much more opportunity to enjoy the outdoors. The North Atlantic is always rough, even in summer, and so it's very short times during a North Atlantic trip that you could be outside, and that's why people loved the Italian line. And it was it was very modern for its time, and of course, because of technology of modern advertising, it was used for a number of commercials. And I think this one is rather cute that I'd like to share with you, where they talk about a bevy of beauties.
A bevy of beauty promenades on the new Italian line flagship, the Andrea Doria, displaying styles with an international flavor. All ashore that's going ashore.
So look at this. This is Countess Consuelo Crespi. Her son and I grew up together in Switzerland. Look at the glamour and elegance of this woman who's waiting to board the Andrea Doria. She was head of Vogue Europe, and her identical twin sister, Gloria Schiff, was head of Vogue America, and they had an incredible, glamorous life. She was even able to look glamorous wearing a life preserver during a life drill on the Andrea Doria, and that's hard to do. So on July 25th of 1956, the Andrea Doria was steaming west. She was one night, it was the night before she was going to dock in New York. And the Stockholm, a much smaller Swedish ship, was sailing east. It was what they call a combi ship. It has half passengers and half freight. But since she was from Sweden and since she had been built to get through icy waters, she had a reinforced ice-breaking bow. They were traveling towards each other in what is known as the Times Square of shipping lanes. It's a very busy area. I've had the privilege of being on private boats going backwards and forwards through that area, and you'd be surprised how often you have to alter course because it is so crowded. So in this day, you heard that the Andrea Doria had Loran, an advanced radar. The Stockholm did not. And what neither of them would have for that time either is the ability to pick up a phone and call the other ship. You had to just go by navigations. There is a rule which is you pass starboard to starboard, green light to green light. I don't want to get too much into the technicalities, but the Andrea Doria, sailing west, obeyed that rule and veered to port. But unfortunately, at the same time as she did, the Stockholm veered, which was an unusual move, in my opinion. And this is a computer reenactment of what happened.
The Stockholm smashes into the side of the Andrea Doria with the force of a massive torpedo.
So by morning, there she was, listing heavily to starboard. She took time. This was not a ship that sank as quickly as the ones that we have reviewed in the past. The aging French liner Ile-de-France was on its way ahead of her, turned around, and came back to rescue the passengers. This is a scene from the Ile-de-France looking over at the sinking Andrea Doria and the Italian line's passengers now aboard the French ship. And this is actual footage. It was close enough to shore. Planes were advanced enough so that newscasters, news people could come above it and actually film its last moments.
Costing between £7 and £8 million, and commissioned only 3 years ago, the Andrea Doria was believed to be unsinkable. Her tragedy is all the more pitiful for that. This, then, was her long drawn-out agony. Not since the loss of the Titanic 44 years ago has a ship of such magnitude suffered in times of peace such a tragic fate. All the magnificence that was a ship, all the pride that was her being, all gone down.
There were some interesting stories. This lady, known as the Miracle Girl, Linda Morgan, she was in her cabin on the Andrea Doria, but she was found on the bow of the Stockholm. When it reversed its engine and pulled out, she had been lifted up from her bunk and brought onto the bow of the Stockholm. Ruth Roman was on board, as well as Betsy Drake, the two actresses. And this picture of the Stockholm limping back to New York. 5 members of the crew of the Stockholm were killed in that bow collision. You see a close-up of it here. 46 people died on the Andrea Doria, by the way. And the Stockholm went to Brooklyn to be fixed. And this was the way she appeared on the bottom of the floor, on the water. She is only in 270 feet of water, which is where the ship would deteriorate much quicker. She is more deteriorated now with much less time underwater than the Titanic. And so we've taken a look at what happened to the Andrea Doria, the magnificent Normandy, the Lusitania, and the Britannic and Titanic. But the thought I'd like to leave in your mind is that there was an infinitesimal number of people who died on North Atlantic tragedies, and much fewer than who died in aircraft. It was still and still is a safe way of travel. Look at all the glamorous people, and let's remember how wonderful traveling was on the North Atlantic, and not just the few terrible stories that I've told. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for your attention. And I wanted to find out if anybody had any questions that I might be able to answer. Assuming that you ladies
everyone.
have time.
Let's share some questions for Rene. In order to raise your hand virtually, click on the participants button at the bottom of your screen, raise your hand, and we will call on you.
I guess we don't have any questions, but
Maybe not yet. I think we should give people.
Oh, okay.
Kathy, we have a question from Robert Stoltz.
Oh, yes. Hi,
Oh,
Robert.
here we go. Yes, Robert Stoltz.
Good afternoon, Robert.
Hi, Rene. How are you? That's fascinating. Oh,
Thank you.
so awesome. So tell me about, modern day transatlantic, the Queen Mary 2, have you been on more modern transatlantic cruises, and would you recommend them?
Yes and yes. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Stoltz is a good friend of mine, and he is an expert on ships and on private boats as well. So there are very few ships that still cross the ocean unless they are cruise ships that are repositioning. Cruise ships are over here in the United States area for the winter season, which they used to be, for the winter season of Caribbean cruising. But in the summertime, many of them are shifted back to Europe, where they cruise the North Cape and the Mediterranean. Those crossings are called repositioning, where a ship is going to be repositioned for its summer or for its winter service. And one can book passage on them and simulate a transatlantic crossing. The only ship that is still crossing with some regularity, and that was in fact designed to cross rather than to cruise, is, as you mentioned, the Queen Mary 2. And she's a wonderful experience. It's a terrific amount of fun to take. Robert and I enjoy it very much. Just remember, the North Atlantic, even in the summer, can be rough. Why is a ship designed and configured differently for crossing than for cruising? The reason is that in cruising, you're outside. There's a lot more going on up on deck. You're in nice warm places, and there's no inclement weather, and that's very different on the North Atlantic. The difference psychologically is interesting also. On a cruise, you are focused on what is going to happen the next day. You have lectures aboard that are destination speeches about what you're going to see, and it's all about getting into the mindset of what's going to happen the next day. Crossing is different. That's, as I said at the very beginning, that's when you can let go of your inhibitions. That's when your worries seem to fade away and you see nothing else for a number of days. It's very refreshing. Some people don't like that. But if you like to have a good book and watch the gorgeous ocean go by, it's something that I strongly would recommend, either to look into a repositioning crossing, which most of the cruise ships do, or the Queen Mary.
Okay, Renee, your next question comes from Jay Goldberg.
Hello, Jay.
Thank you again for a very informative presentation. Just a quick question regarding the Andrea Doria and Stockholm. In the end, did either country acknowledge responsibility or guilt, and was there any repercussion for either country because of that?
It's an excellent question. Of course, as you can imagine, there were lots of inquiries. As I alluded to when I was talking about it, in my opinion, the Andrea Doria did not make a crucial error, and the Stockholm did. However, there is a big feeling that, you know, we just finished a war with the Germans and the Italians. And so Italians did not really have a really great reputation here at the time of that inquiry. And what was decided was it was a draw. It was no one's fault. The Stockholm misinterpreted the light as it was coming through the fog. I happen to think it was the Stockholm's fault, but that's not what the inquiry says. But I do believe that if you Google the story, you'll probably come up with some justification for what I just said.
Okay.
Thank you.
Renee, now you have a question from Henrik Vanderlip.
Hello, Henrik. While Henrik is finding the microphone button, may I tell you that I have known Henrik Vanderlip for a half a century. We were classmates together in Switzerland, and his family did cross on ships also. Hello, Henrik, are you with us?
I am. Thank you. Good to see you. My question is a simple one. If the Titanic sank because 5 of the compartments were compromised, why did the hospital ship sink with just one mine hitting it on the side of the ship?
It's a brilliant question. Where it hit, the explosion crippled 2 doors, 2 of the vertical compartment doors, and tore an enormous hole in the ship. And I guess that's the only reason. I would have thought the captain would have tried to close the others, but I know that the whole front part of the ship just basically blew apart.
Now we'll hear from Maris Newmark.
Hello, Maris. Good to see you.
Several places. And my question is, on the Normandy, what happened to all the Lalique and all the beautiful artwork? Who has it now? Where is it now?
So my father was a Frenchman, and before they separated, my parents had a home on Eastern Long Island. I had alluded to the fact that some of the members of the Franco-American community got together to save this. My father was one of those people. They had converted a carriage house on their property for crates of all of these things. And like all of the other Franco-Americans who got together to save this, all of those items were disclosed and were given back to the French. The French had lost during the war. The French had lost Normandy, of course, and their other main ship, the Ile-de-France, had been a prisoner of war ship. It needed to be completely rehabilitated. As part of the damages, the war damages that were given to France, was the former German flagship Europa, which became French. It had been sunk, it had been scuttled, so it was a mess. The point being is that both the new French ships, the Europa, which was rechristened Liberté, and the Ile-de-France, needed interiors. They had nothing left. So all of the Normandy's things that were saved were sent to France while those ships were being rehabilitated. And there were many areas in both ships that were extremely reminiscent of Normandy's interiors. Once those ships were scrapped, all of those items were auctioned off. And Sotheby's used to have an annual auction just of ship memorabilia, notably the French line.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, our next question comes from Cindy Kahn.
Hi. The lady before asked my question, but my husband has a question he'd like to ask.
Please.
Hi, how much did people pay for first-class passage on some of these ships?
Very good point. I of course have recalculated it in modern day money, and I'll give you the answer, of course. But then please allow me to qualify it a little bit. About $100,000 round trip. But let me just tell you that if you look now on what they call owners' suites are on major cruise ships or on the QE2, I beg your pardon, on the Queen Mary 2, you will find that those are the costs, even today, of a grand owner's suite on one of those ships. So yes, it was frightfully expensive. It was certainly about the equivalent of buying a luxury car. But I want to point out that Normandy never made any money. She was too elegant. She was too large. She was basically a first-class ship. Money wasn't made in first class. The image was important to be projected in the first-class accommodations. Money was made in steerage and in second class.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Well, I think this is going to be our last question. We're going to call on William Landa.
Hello, Bill.
Hello, I'm just going to get my microphone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, great. Hi, Renee. My mom, actually, Lucille, has a question for you, okay?
Great.
Hello, Renee. It's so good to see you.
Thank you.
And you know, I'm your biggest fan. And I have your book on Normandy, and I love it. I read it many, many times. And I'd like to know, do you have a personal collection of memorabilia from any of these ships?
We do. I can't pull the thing apart and start to show you around, but I actually had an entire apartment in a larger house in what I used to call my Marie Antoinette days. I had a full apartment furnished with all of French line, and notably Normandy articles. They were all bought at auction, and I do cherish them. Robert is sitting right over there now in a chair, dining room chair from the Normandy. We have a few things of them in the house. And still in storage, I have two of the grand doors to the biggest suites of Normandy that are in three types of a different inlaid wood, beautiful deco with brass inlay. Normandy was the best example of refined deco. Some of the earlier ships, like the Queen Mary. The Queen Mary was a great ship, but the Queen Mary was an example of earlier deco. Normandy was a late, refined version of deco.
Well, thank you so much, Renee. This was fascinating. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us today and share your knowledge of these famous disasters at sea. And thank all of you for joining us as well. Look for your email with additional meaningful ways to connect with our Federation and Jewish community during these unprecedented times. Together with our caring community, we will heal, we will help, and we will give. Stay safe and be well. Thank you.